Chivalry had first grown out of the romanticism of the knights who went off to fight the Crusades, but it developed into a code of rules adhered to by opposing forces engaged in castle siege warfare, and the stories of chivalry brought back by the Crusaders returning from the Holy Land were the subject of minnesongers, who traveled from town to town singing for their supper. The minnesongs were historical tales set to music, and the popularity of the minnesongers guaranteed that history would continue to be recorded through these musical stories, and the best of them turned into true rock stars. As cities grew, the minnesonger rock stars turned into actors, and the musical portion of the songs was dropped, and modern poetry was born, and theater became the teaching of chivalry without the poetry or the music. Frederick Barbarossa's grandson was crowned the Holy Roman Emperor and the King of Jerusalem in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in 1225, and he managed that not by conquering Arabs in battle, but by learning to speak Arabic. Frederick Barbarossa's grandson started the Teutonic Order, and his Teutonic knights wore a black cross, not the red one of the simple crusaders. And 100 years later, Edward III would push the age of chivalry forward in earnest. Frederick Barbarossa had died on the Third Crusade, and his grandson would grow up in Sicily and spend very little time in Germany, and as King of Jerusalem, Barbarossa's grandson ruled for 32 years from his pleasant Mediterranean royal court at Palermo, where he liked to do medical experiments on animals and on prisoners, and he had a man lowered into a volcano to find out if it was the gates of hell. And he had a man dive for the bottom of the ocean until he drowned, and he had babies raised in isolation to see what language they would speak. And Frederick Barbarossa's grandson spoke 6 languages himself, but mostly he kept himself surrounded by Sicilians. With civil war breaking out in England, all attempts to gain a foothold in Sicily were abandoned by the English, since it turned out to be cheaper to pay the Sicilians to let Englishmen visit Sicily, from whence they could keep an eye on the Pope, rather than taking it over by force of arms. Frederick Barbarossa's grandson told such tales of his grandfather's escapades in the Holy Land that he caught the imagination of a Moslem pirate who lived from 1475 to 1546, terrorizing the Mediterranean, and Barbarossa meant Redbeard in Italian, and the Moslem pirate called himself Barbarossa to mirror the legendary German warrior, and the Muslims in Afghanistan heard about Redbeard and started dyeing their own beards red. Barbarossa's grandson fortified enough castles in Swabia and Bohemia and Austria to keep out both the Muslims and the Mongols, while Hungary was being hit hard. And one of the best castles Barbarossa's grandson built was the Teutonic castle at Königsberg in 1257, that would become the seat of the Order of the Black Eagle, the highest order of chivalry in the Kingdom of Prussia. The Teutonic Knights had begun as the Order of the House of St. Mary of the Germans in Jerusalem, and the Order of the Black Eagle would be founded in January of 1701, the very same year the British started their House of Hanover, and in large part as a reaction to it. When Hitler was holding out in the bunker in Berlin in April of 1945, the whispers being passed up and down the halls were, "Remember Königsberg." Every German knew about the legend of the siege of Königsberg Castle in 1262, and the castle at Königsberg had been the foremost headquarters of the Teutonic Order, and in the legend, a sea captain from Lübeck had brought the besieged knights relief by boat, coming in the dark of night up the river to the castle, and the Teutonic Knights would be victorious in the end, thanks to the brave and resourceful sea captain. Königsberg Castle was right in the heart of Old Prussia, and today the castle is near Kaliningrad's Amber Museum, and that historic castle was the reason so many German troops became trapped in the Courland Pocket during and after the Battle of the Bulge, where they would wait for the anticipated Königsberg miracle. The RAF bombed the Königsberg Castle on the 26th of August in 1944, using 174 Lancaster bombers, and then again on the 29th of August with 480 tons of high explosives and incendiaries dropped from 189 Lancasters, and the castle was extensively damaged, and by the time the Russians arrived, 90% of the city of Königsberg had already been destroyed. The Soviets got rid of what was left of the Germans, and they renamed the city Kaliningrad, and would use the port as the base for their Baltic fleet. And Kaliningrad was 86 square miles of territory on the coast of the Baltic Sea between Lithuania and Poland, and there was no border in Kaliningrad contiguous with Russia. And there was no border in Kaliningrad contiguous with Russia. Because Russians were exceptionally superstitious, and the thick walls of the Königsberg Castle had stood up to being bombed by the British, perceived as a bad omen, Brezhnev had every remaining stone blown up in 1968. Himmler had been waiting in his train in the center of the old Teutonic Crusader state of Neumark, and while Goebbels was making movies and Goering was out collecting art, the bulk of the German hierarchy had been convinced that Germany would win the war because they had so much musical history to back up their endeavor. Carmina Burana had been written by monks in 1230 after the Crusades and in the wake of the Black Plague in order to cheer themselves up, and the Carmina Burana manuscript found in a Bavarian monastery included a song written by Blondel. After the Dark Ages, German villages had to endure a few hundred more years of barbarism, including torture with red-hot pincers and pokers, eye gouging and tongues cut off, and foreheads branded with marks to show who was guilty of what and who belonged to whom, and the only glimmer of hope in all this cruelty were the traveling musicians singing rock songs. And the mini-songers went a long way towards explaining what was going on. And why? When the nobles weren't fighting each other, they were fighting the Pope and his many bishops, and the church had more money than most barons and princes, and when ordinary people heard the mini-songers, they found out what had been happening in the wider world, and while the words and the tunes were constantly altered, the historical characters remained true to actual people. The Minnesonger was a love songer because the rock songs were more about love than about history, and many of the songs had come from the pre-Christian days of the North Country and told about people in the Nordic lands before they mixed with non-Scandinavian Germans. It was important that the events of which they sang stayed true to real life in order to give honor and legitimacy to these news reports so that people with money would be willing to pay a decent fee to host the singers, since the rock songs were basically anonymous and had usually been pieced together from many different sources. A variety of versions were later written down, and English poets contributed Beowulf and the Song of Roland, followed by the King Arthur's Stories by Malory, and Beowulf had been written in the 8th century right before Charlemagne was crowned. The Parzival story went in many different directions in France and in England, and for the Germans, the story grew into the legend of the Fisher King, who was wounded in the groin and could do nothing to help himself, and he could only be cured by a stranger's question. When Parzival went to see the Fisher King, he didn't ask what had caused the wound, because Parzival wanted to show that he had polite good manners, yet asking that question had been exactly what was needed to save the dying king, and it would have broken the spell and saved the whole kingdom. Thereafter, the Parzival character went to England to meet the Knights of the Round Table, and then they all went off looking for the Holy Grail that they thought would be needed to heal the Fisher King, and Zarathustra was one of the knights among them, who used laughter instead of a sword. A passage quoted from a rock song in a superb book called The Orphan Stone, the Minnesinger Dream of Reich said, How like a wolf to weep and say, "Don't grudge me my paltry prey, I find it where I can, my hunger is great, no blame is mine. The world goes on always the same, many a fat Jew sits in his house who's never done one bit of good. False advantages are always his, heaps of money and ill-gotten goods. He chides me over a stolen goose, yah, to be honest, was all my hope. What can I say, it wasn't to be, from hunger I robbed, just to be free, so lay it on them who drove me to theft, the fat are to blame as much as the lean. The Orphan Stone, the Minnesinger Dream of Reich by Richard J. Burleth, St. Francis College, New York, Greenwood Press, 1990, page 247. Virtue for the German was not simply a matter of noble birth, because the brains and wits of an ordinary man could win him a kingdom. And when the rock songs died out after the German Hohenstaufens reached the end of their line with Barbarossa's grandson in 1250, and the last of the divine kings were replaced by the Habsburgs, the Jews who had found some shelter in the courts of the German kings followed the rest of the wandering Jews into the anonymous hinterlands of Europe. The rock songs had been used to teach about the government, informing the peasants about the structure and function of the nobility by telling stories of the bravery of kings and queens and courtiers. And people believed in them, whether or not they were bankably true. The rock songs could be sung by farmers in the fields or by soldiers marching off to war, and they spoke to the best in everyone and appealed to everything that was noble and dignified and good. Noble and dignified and good. When a collection of the rock songs was finally compiled into one book, it was something of a miracle that a book that old could survive, not only because of its age, but because parchment was precious and was regularly scraped clean and reused. The collection of songs was called the Rhyming Book of the Reich, or the Book of Kaisers, and it was a national icon to the Germanic peoples. And the French kept it locked away in Paris because they didn't want Germany to have anything more to help them in unifying over old glories. In 1888, the Germans raised 400,000 gold marks by popular donations to get it back to the fatherland, and the Kaiser and Bismarck donated their share, and the French agreed to sell it because they were paying reparations to the Second Reich after the Franco-Prussian War. Hitler put it in a cave, and the American army would give it back to Heidelberg University in 1947. And many Europeans retained fond memories of the good old days when kings ruled absolutely and the government was strong, and there had been no questioning where one's duty and proper loyalty ought to be directed. German knights lived in the woods, eating roots and berries, and drinking pure, clear mountain spring water. And while the Roman Pope had sacraments and indulgences and the comforting ceremony of the Mass, German knights sang stories of their perilous quests in exciting lands, full of supernatural encounters while they performed mighty deeds that required great suffering and courage, their hardships interspersed with miracles and magic. The knight's code of chivalry was spread by the traveling Minnesongers with the help of their intricate musical instruments, and the songs taught that the nobility were worthy and deserving of the fruits of everyone's labor, and to keep this narrative alive, the nobility eagerly donated to the welfare of the singers, and they also commissioned elaborate tapestries to be embroidered illustrating the stories. Instead of God's grace or divine intervention, German knights survived by their strength and by their skill with swords, and the church didn't like the knights who were not dependent on charity, but were armored for battle and hardened by want. The Teutonic knights had a myth about a lost crystal that had been a big heart-shaped jewel on the front of Charlemagne's crown, and the lost crystal had been brought from the east, perhaps from Persia, and the east was das Morgenland, the land of the morning from where the rising sun emerged, and the east was magical and promising, and from there the 3 wise men had come bringing gifts to the Christ child. The myth of the lost crystal grew as time passed to become a crystal kept safe by the neutral angels during the Lucifer rebellion, and there were other myths about magic stones, but the lost crystal was called the pole star of princes, and while nobody knew what color the lost crystal was, they were certain that it had been shaped like a heart, and that there was now only a hole left in the front of Charlemagne's crown where it had once been. The Crusaders had come from Charlemagne's Holy Roman Empire, and the grandson of the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa had been born the week after Richard's friend Leopold died in 1194, and Barbarossa's grandson wanted to create an empire of the Mediterranean while the English were busy trying to colonize France. The rock songs told the story of when Richard's friend Leopold of Austria had gotten so bloody in the fighting in the Holy Land that they had to tie a white sash around him to tell him apart from the others, and that was how the Austrian flag became a white stripe on a crimson background, although another version was that his sash had been removed for some reason, and having been covered in blood from head to toe, its removal had left a white stripe around his waist. The flag and heraldic arms of the King of Jerusalem was a gold cross potent on a silver field, and the cross potent was an altered swastika or a crutch cross. The grandson of Frederick Barbarossa's grandson would be defeated by the French outside Rome in 1268, and the French beheaded him 2 months later at the age of 16, along with his 18-year-old friend from Baden with whom he was inseparable, and the heraldic arms of the King of Jerusalem went to the grave with them, even though the French tried to keep the title alive, but after what they'd done to Conradin, their claim lacked merit. The people of Italy had supported this last Hohenstaufen named Conradin, but the Pope had sided with the French, and the Pope had more money to pay professional soldiers. When Conradin and his friend had tried to flee, their blonde hair gave them away among the population of Italy, and the French captured the crown of Charlemagne, along with Conradin, and the lost crystal went missing around 1350 A.D. A large heart-shaped sapphire was put in place of the original stone that had gotten lost somewhere on the way to Jerusalem, but everyone knew it was a meager substitute for the real thing. As soon as news of Frederick Barbarossa's death had reached Germany during the Third Crusade, a rock song was written called Das Nibelungenlied that was as long as the Iliad, and Wagner's Ring would be this rock song reconstituted, about which Fritz Lang would make a movie in 1924 that Hitler enjoyed watching. The question for the German had always predominantly been, why do men and women fall in love? And they didn't just ask the question, they sang and danced about it. And while the story of Tristan had first been written by an Englishman in Eleanor of Aquitaine's court, and most of it had become lost, what remained had been transformed into a specifically German rock song. In German poetry, love was transcendent and magical and prevailed in the face of death and disaster, and even if the quest for love brought down an entire kingdom, it would emerge triumphant in the end. The Kriemhild story in Das Nibelungenlied was about a hidden treasure of gold kept secret because anyone who knew its location would be murdered, and Princess Kriemhild's brother had killed her first husband so he could send her off to marry the King of Hungary, or Attila the Hun, and that would make her the Queen of the Huns, and so Kriemhild had her brother killed, and Wagner was dedicated to bringing this story back to life, and he wrote music to go with it that in some places came close to the original tunes of the Minnesingers. Wagner's ring about the Nibelungen was uniquely German, rather than the more mild pastoral poetry written by the English. And Hitler did not want to conquer England because he wanted the English royals to recognize him as their cultural cousin and treat him as a proper neighboring sovereign. And Hitler swore to Eva that he would not marry her until he could make her the queen of the fatherland. Like Adolf Hitler, German kings had come from Austria for 600 years, until 1867 when the Prussians took over, and with the rise of opera and theater displacing the Minnesingers and bringing about the decline of the rock songs, the chivalric code had been fading into a distant memory, and Hitler wanted to bring all that back. And he had his portrait painted on horseback, wearing a shining suit of armor with a Nazi banner held aloft. The German theme of betrayal in the rock songs was carried through by the Nazis, who blamed Jews after the Great War for the stab-in-the-back scheme written up in the Versailles Treaty, and German churches preached the story of Jesus as being one of his betrayal rather than promulgating a message of redemption or fulfillment. And the Passion Play at Oberammergau was a popular spectacle where the crowd would boo and hiss at the Jewish Judas. The Mad King Ludwig especially enjoyed attending at Oberammergau so he could lose himself in the gallant stories about the brave knights of the Crusades, and the original rock songs about the search for a holy grail that could heal a king wounded by his own sacred sword had first appeared in writing in France around 1190, and it had spread from there throughout Europe. In all the versions, the heroes would disguise themselves so they could find shelter among their enemies, and every time they tried to escape, they would become lost, usually at sea. As the tale reached Germany, it became the story of a beloved wounded hero named Tristan, and only the willing heart-blood of a godly virgin could save him. And in Tristan's story, two people drank a secret potion put into wine, and they fell in love, even though the woman was supposed to marry the king. So she was given a trial by ordeal with a red-hot iron, but it didn't burn her, so she was allowed to go live in a cave with her lover Tristan. In Spenser's Bower of Bliss from Fairy Queen, they slept on a huge crystal, and the cave was their church, and the bed was their altar, and this sort of private betrothal without benefit of clergy was sacred in Germany up until the Council of Trent in 1563. As the story goes, one day the German king came riding through the woods and found the cave and looked in at the beautiful people sleeping there, and he realized that being a king was not as good as being a lover, and to the German poet, even God knew that being God was not as good as being loved. The rock songs were written down in the form of poems, and some of them had musical chords written alongside the poetry, but the actual musical notes were lost because everyone knew the tunes at the time, so the music may not have ever been written down, just as the tune to Na Nanny Nana was ubiquitous in all languages and needed no notes in order to follow the tune. The rock songs had been used not just to carry gossip from village to village, and not merely as a source of news, but more importantly it was a who's who, a sort of social register that determined which members of the nobility were recognized as legitimate and worthy of homage, and those who were in decline. And the bulk of the surviving rock songs were about the Holy Grail and the magic spear. And in the search for the Holy Grail, the keeper of the Grail must stay anonymous. The rock songs had become theater actors, The rock stars had become theater actors after the original rock songs were repeated until people got sick of them, and theater actors stayed in one place so people could come to see them rather than the singers traveling between villages. And the recalcitrant church people thought knights in armor were too far removed from what had become of the church. With the invention of the printing press, the Minnesonger poetry could be shared on paper, and after poetry came the newspapers and printed pamphlets that fueled the Year of Revolutions in 1848. And pamphlets were popular because the messages could be delivered without people having to dress up to attend the theater, and pamphlets were usually free, pinned up in public places, and distributed liberally without having to pay for a newspaper.